Right, the wiring, the scary part, the unseen friend or foe that is electricity. The part that can literally either injure you or turn your bike into a burning pile of ash if you dare do it wrong. People study this for years of their life, and here you are trying such a dangerous thing because, well, you wired a few turn signals a few times in your life. I mean, what's the worst that could possibly happen? Death? I like those odds. Besides, I've got a corner full of real ones backing me, the newest of which include Brian Donegan, Oscar S., and Garrett Grant. With gracious folks like these three behind me, I was ready to take on this challenge, so let's just get on with it. So my bike was still cocooned from where we last left off in the previous episode. I was doing my best to keep it protected from the elements since this was a particularly rainy week. And the bike was looking as good as I remembered it. Right, step one was to drill out 2 more zip tie mounting holes for the grounding plate, since 2 wouldn't be enough out on the road. You know, I was planning to mount something or maybe everything to it, so I was gonna have to make it a lot more sturdy than it is. Step 2 was to take a head count of all the necessary pieces for the bike that I'd have to find a place for. The coils, the air sensor, the injection brain, the radiator fan, and the radiator itself. I'll be replacing the radiator soon enough to go with these new silicone hoses, but I could use the old one to mock up everything. Now that I know the hoses fit like they should, I then went to install a fan onto the radiator. I'd actually realized that the fan that came with the bike was broken, so this fan is a working one that I purchased from eBay. The thing is, these fans are so poorly designed and fault prone that really, who knows how long it'll stay working until it breaks again. With the cooling system mounted, I could then figure out how to mount the airflow sensor without bumping up against that hose behind it. In the end, I had to settle on this orientation to clear the hose. The good thing is that this actually left me with ample room to the left of it to mount more things under the tank. And this was actually my first idea of where I was going to put the injection controller. But since I couldn't use all 3 mounting holes for the brain, I knew that this thing would vibrate to hell if I rode it like this. So instead I just settled for putting it under the seat, which looks way better. And for the sake of simplicity, I just also assumed that I'll be running the battery in the factory location since there's room for it even after we cross-brace the frame. I had a serious eureka moment for where I was gonna put those pesky coils, but I had noticed that the sky was getting darker. Why? The snow was coming. So I packed up everything and continued working inside. And it just started snowing. I came in at the right time, didn't I? So after all of that fiddling around outside trying to figure out where I was going to mount stuff, I came to the conclusion that I'm going to mount the coils onto this metal sheet, the one that goes under the tank. And this is one of the holes that I'm going to use. So if I mount it like that with the leads coming like facing the inside of the engine, I'm going to have this hole mounted to this one. I'm going to make another one for this one. And then 3, 4. So it's going to be mounted from 4 places. The thing is, when they come originally, it's mounted by these. So it's like 2 little loops that go through the engine block, and you hang them from there with this. And then these 4 bolt holes, these are for a cover that goes over, like a plastic cover that covers them from the elements. But instead, I'm going to mount it with this since that would be more stable than, you know, hanging them upside down like that. It's gonna, you know, swing around. Now the thing about it is that even though these are threaded, but no self-respecting bolt will make it through there and hold this heavy thing up. You know. So I'm gonna just drill these out a little bit and make it so that I could use bigger bolts. So, you know, strong bolts that'll hold these things up. These are pretty heavy. I'm glad I came to that conclusion, because now I'm gonna just put the brain under the seat because I have enough space. I didn't think I was gonna have enough space, and I thought it was gonna look kind of goofy under there, but it looks pretty good, especially if I paint it black instead of this aluminum color. If I change it to black, it'll blend in pretty nicely. Now, the reason why I want to relocate these instead of putting them on the side of the block is because I have this exhaust coming that basically uses that space on the side of the block under the valve cover and right next to the starter. It's going to be an exhaust that goes like up and through that and then out the back. So I have to relocate these somewhere. And I don't want to put these under the seat because, well, kind of chunky. They're not really low profile. So if I put them under the tank and, you know, over the engine block, it looks like it's supposed to be there.
Riders on the storm, riders on the storm, into this world we're born, into this world we're flown, like a dog without a bone and knocked around alone, riders on the storm. There's a killer on the road. His brain is squirming like a toad. Take a long holiday.
Those KLR bolts actually came in very handy in a couple places. I really scored when I got these for free. Check it out. Check it out. It's looking pretty good. These are all rigidly attached, which is great, because now I can use that exhaust that I want to use. I put some electrical tape around the edges to help protect the frame, and I'll likely use some foam or something else to dampen the vibrations if there's any, like, you know, resonance when the engine is running. But a quick break from the electrics, if I may. I just want to resolve the oil pump issue that was left over from the last episode. Check this out. All right, so one of these is the seals that came with the kit that I bought, and I think it's this one. Yeah, it's this one. Now, I just bought a second one thinking that it would be larger than this one, because remember I said that this one doesn't fit. Come to find out, these are the exact same size, so obviously they don't fit. But what I did realize is that I was looking at some videos, and I think this, you see that kind of dirty metal, I don't know, that thin piece of metal right there? I thought that was part of the pump, but it looks like that's might be like part of an old seal, like this old water seal. That might just be left in there, because remember, everything disintegrated when I was hammering it out. And you can see the weep hole right there on the edge. That's supposed to be, if I put the rubber seal, it's gonna block that, you know? So the rubber seal is supposed to sit way further down than that. So it's clear that this has to be a piece of the old seal that didn't come out with everything else, you know, because everything just disintegrated. So I'm gonna try to push that out, and if I ruin the housing, then so be it. But I'm gonna at least try, because I think I have a good feeling that's what the problem is. So my hunch was definitely right, and look at this. Oh, let me get a screwdriver. Look at this. Insane. I had to beat the ever-loving crap out of this thing to get it out. And the crazy thing is, like, the rubber one goes behind this metal one. And I think the rubber one disintegrated before I even touched it. I think it disintegrated a long time ago. Crazy. But look how much space is down there now. So, see that hole right there on the left? Now I have space to put the rubber seal in. instead of it blocking it off. All right, so there's a YouTuber named Kennyraceboy, and he did an excellent tutorial for how to rebuild these pumps. I show every step here, but if you want an actual guide, you should go and check his video out. The rubber oil shaft seal went on with no problem after I removed that ridiculous piece of metal that was stuck in there. I also greased up the seat so the seal could just slide right in. A tiny, tiny, tiny amount of grease helps to slide the whole thing through because it's actually a tight fit. You may notice that the new shaft kind of like scrapes on the housing a little bit. You could probably hear it in the video, but that's fine. It just has to break in. This is a brand new shaft. The new water seal is a tight fit onto the pump shaft, so it's supposed to be pressed into it. Now, I don't have a press, so I had to use a hammer and a specially made tool for installing this seal. It's very easy to destroy this metal seal without this tool, so just bite the bullet and get it when you buy a rebuild kit. Now, I couldn't find my rubber mallet, so I just had to use a hammer and I tapped it in lightly. The outer lip of the seal will contact the pump housing, and that's basically when you know you're done. In order to install the updated impeller, you have to use this spacer, but make sure you center it onto the impeller before you torque the bolt down. This bolt gets torqued down to 33 Newton meters. Now, I installed the second driven gear to the pump here, but I definitely recommend you installing that to the block itself when you're refitting the pump to it. The pump was complete, so I just sat it to the side and I installed it on the following day. See, the thing about K100s is the aftermarket isn't super strong, but there's one site that has very much filled that void. It's called Cafe for a Racer. Not only do they carry a huge catalog of K-bike parts, but they also create their own custom parts like seats, brackets, and last but not least, exhausts. And I'll be honest, the K100 isn't exactly the prettiest bike when it comes to exhaust pipes because, well, the shape of the brick means that the pipes have to travel an uncomfortably long distance in a straight line, and it just doesn't look very natural. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention this. Turns out the pipes that came with my bike are actually the aftermarket pipes from the period. They're from a brand called Luftmeister, and they're apparently special because they have equal length headers. You know, I wonder how much that influences the sound because I know equal length headers will actually remove that classic Subaru rumble. Anyway, those pipes are short enough to look good, but you know, I already had my eyes on these new ones since day one. I was just waiting on the best moment to buy them. So, what's in the box? Well, you get a 4-into-1 collector, a megaphone muffler with a removable baffle, and then all 4 header pipes, along with a few springs to hold it all together.
If you give this man a ride, sweet family will die. Killer on the road.
Now, my first attempt at installing it saw that I tried to do each header one by one, but no, the better way to do it is to just install them all at once, with the entire system together except the muffler. It's a piece of cake that way, but the problem is that I remembered that I had lost a few exhaust studs for the header pipes while I was running the bike around in preparation for the bike show. They fell out onto the road somewhere, but even while missing 3, I was able to install the pipes to not only see how they looked, but to also see how much room I have for electrics in that area. The exhaust is probably going to have a divided opinion since it's so in your face, but in my opinion, it looks better than I ever hoped. The only problem is that the muffler, since I have a fatter tire in the back, the muffler comes out over the tire, so the first bump and that muffler is going to get crushed. So I have to run a shorter muffler or change the angle or whatever. I just can't run this megaphone, unfortunately, and I like how it looks. So that sucks. Now, I've since ordered some exhaust studs, so soon this thing will be mounted sturdily for actual riding. Alright, enough stalling. It's time for the heavy electrical stuff. So, one morning I grabbed my cut-down harness and I started studying. The YouTuber that I mentioned before, Mikeyfrompiha, had updated his wiring diagram to include all 12-volt power wires that should be plugged into the M unit to run the bike. So there's a total of 5 of them. But this is assuming that your harness was cut down correctly. You know, that's one thing that I regret, you know, kind of being unable to make a guide on how to cut your harness down. Because when I did it, I was entirely winging it with no guide apart from the stock BMW diagram. I saw Mikey's diagram afterwards to confirm if I did it right. Now, with that said, not only was I more focused on getting it right the first time than I was on filming, but also, why act like I know what I'm doing if I really don't? if you plan to run your bike with an M unit, just take a look at what I'm about to show you so you know what to keep from your harness. So instead of me showing you what to take, I'll just show you what to keep because I have what you have to keep. So take a look, reference the diagram that I'm posting in the description, by the way, because everything that I use in videos is put in the description. So please look in there to see if what you're wondering about is there before you ask me about it. As a scholar, I take care to list all my sources. Now, all credit for the diagram goes to Mikeyfrompiha. Hell, he made his own video recently about it if you'd like to get some extra info on the process. Okay, I'll stop yapping so I can let my other self yap. Okay, so I'm getting ready to take the plunge into these electrics. But before I do anything, I actually just pulled out all the wires and I just took a look at them. That YouTuber that I mentioned before who created the wiring diagram, he actually updated it with 4 wires that you have to plug into the ignition output for the M unit. And there's also one that you have to plug into the starter output. So on my right is basically what was left of the main harness, which includes like the starter relay, things that go into the, the alternator. You got one of the relays over there for the temperature, which I won't need because I'm just going to put the fan on a manual switch. Battery cables, these go to the coils. This one goes to the ignition module. And then on the left is the fuel injection harness. So let's start with this one since it's easy to look at. As a matter of fact, I'm gonna go get my phone real quick. So basically, there's 4 cables that you have to plug into the ignition output on the M unit. And it's green and red for the fuel injection module, green and yellow for the coils, green and white for the fuel pump, and green and yellow for the ignition module. And then you have this black and yellow. My camera just decided to stop focusing. You got the black and yellow for the ignition module that you have to plug into the starter output. So first one is the green and red, which goes to the fuel injection. So this is the plug for the fuel injection brain, but where it plugs into the harness is over here, right? So green and red right there, you see the bottom one? Very fitting for Christmas. So that's where it plugs into the main harness, which is this connection right here, and you can see I actually have it labeled from before. And you could trace the green and red wire back to this, the fuel pump relay. So this basically bounced out back somewhere, probably to the plus 12, I guess, maybe. But basically, I think you could probably just cut this from here, because remember, I'm learning too. I don't really 100% know what I'm doing. But I could probably just cut this from here, chuck this relay, and then just plug this green and red wire straight to the M unit. Then you got a green and yellow to the coils. Now, the whole coil cluster is right here, as you can see, which I labeled. Always label your stuff, man. This is making this thing so much easier because I haven't touched this in months, and I have everything labeled for myself. But so tracing that back, that green and yellow back to here, and this is where the kill switch was. So the kill switch went in between these 2 wires. So the one that goes to the coils, which provides power to the coils. So basically, when you hit the kill switch, it cuts this 12-volt wire to the coils, and this one goes back to, as the diagram says. So we found the one to the coils. Now there's also a green and yellow to the ignition module. So you can see this kind of branches off in 3 directions. I'm guessing that this one that I cut was the one that gave it power. The one going down here goes to the coils, as we established. And then this one that goes to the right goes to ignition control, the ignition module, whatever you want to call it, same thing. So this is the connection for that. That's basically 2 birds with 1 stone. So we got one, that was the one to the ignition, the green and red one, the big one. We got green and yellow to the coils. We got, with 2 birds with 1 stone, green and yellow to the ignition module. And now we just have green and white to the fuel pump. So Like I said, I have everything labeled. Just gotta find it. Ah, here it is. So, and I actually have everything sectioned off, man. I'm so glad I did it this way. This is making my life so much easier. So this is going to the gas tank, right? Now these over here, I deduced that these are the fuel gauges. When I was cutting everything out willy-nilly, I deduced that these were the fuel gauges. And obviously BMW, brown is ground. Don't forget that, kids, brown is ground. And then you got the green and white cable. So I nailed it. And so I labeled it to the ignition. I realized that I don't need this at all. I don't need this relay at all. So this goes to this went to the fan, the coolant temperature warning light, and I'm gonna be running a manual dial for the engine temp. So I don't need that. You got the ground here. But yeah, so I should be able to just cut this off of that, cut that out completely, since I'm running a manual fan anyway, and then just plug this straight to the ignition. I don't even have to, like, splice it or anything. And plus, I want to run a manual fuel pump. So instead of, this fuel pump getting power, as soon as you like turn the key, and then you hear is, from the fuel pump going, I want to put this to a manual switch and see if that works out, because I think I'll prefer being able to turn the fuel pump on and off, in case I just want to, have the lights on or something, and not have to hear that fuel pump going off crazy. And lastly, you got the black and yellow wire that goes from start to ignition 6. So it's coming from the ignition module. Now, the reason why I know which inputs these are, to double check, is because he's labeled them. So you got the ignition module, and you have ignition 6, which goes to the M unit. So let's see. So black and yellow, right? As we established, this one is to the ignition. So we just got to find the black and yellow wire that comes from it, which is this one. And the thing that makes me feel good is that I put starter switch, because this went to the starter switch when I was cutting the harness down, and this is labeled as so. And then this is just starter relay, blah blah blah, the obvious stuff. So yeah, like I said, to recap, basically, I want to run a manual fan and a manual fuel pump. I don't want to have those. I don't want to deal with a relay and getting this thing right, and having to wait till the temperature goes crazy to know if the fan works or not. No, I just want to have it on a manual switch. I'll look at the. I think it's down here, actually. Let me show you. Yeah, I bought this this gauge that goes into where the fuel, not the fuel filler, the oil filler cap that goes on the crank cover. Yeah, this is gonna help me keep track of the temperature, and I don't have to wire anything. It's just a simple analog gauge, which is, not only helps in the, bringing the bike back to a little bit of a old school look, but it's also a lot easier to deal with. I mean, it's not sensing the coolant temperature, which would be ideal. It's sensing the oil temperature, but whatever, gives you pretty much the same idea. So yeah, that's the plan of attack. I got a bunch of supplies the other day. So I got some connectors, got some lead-free solder so I don't die. I got some replacement fuel injection connections for the, I think it's EV1. Because if you guys remember, these are toast. They get real brittle after 30 years. I got some L brackets so I can mount stuff up, maybe rig something up for the the air filter, something like that. And I got another kit of fuel injection connectors. as well as a, I guess they call it like a nutsert, like a rivet tool that has like threads basically on a rivet. And of course I got everything else in this box to help me get this job done. Now I already know that I can pretty much run the radiator with just a manual switch, but I want to test if it works out with the fuel pump that's in the gas tank. So here's the gas tank connection. Like I said, those are the fuel gauge wires, which are not plugged into anything. You got your ground cable, which just leaves the power cable for the fuel pump. Where this goes is to the fuel pump relay, and then another wire branches off from that and goes to the temperature sensor relay for whatever reason. I don't know. So this can pretty much go. This is like, and only two things are even plugged in right now, and those are the two things that I mentioned before. So this can go. This can probably go, but I'm gonna hold off on cutting this for a second. But I'm gonna test to see if I can run the fuel pump with just a ground switch. So I just cut this out of the harness, labeled where I cut, and this is going to the fuel injection harness. The temperature sensor is plugged into this. The one that plugs into the coolant neck, yeah. So yeah, that's going. And now this is the fuel tank harness, as you probably know at this point. And this is where it plugs into the main harness, which then goes into the fuel pump relay, connected by this green and red wire, but not this green and red wire. This is that's why he wrote large, because this is the large one. This one is it's hard to focus on wires. This is a nightmare. But this is the smaller green and red wire. And since I unplugged the relay over there, it's just going to the fuel tank. Now, I think I'm just gonna cut it right here, just so I could plug this straight into the M unit and see what happens. The plan was to plug the tank into the auxiliary output on the M unit, but the settings for both auxiliaries were on some weird protocol. See, you can change the behavior on the phone app, but that's a can of worms that I didn't need to open yet. So I just plugged it into the horn output or something like that. fuel injection harness generally resides entirely on the engine area, and also I didn't have to remove anything from it, only had to lengthen or shorten wires here and there, so it seemed like a fitting starting point. So I started with the fuel injector connections. I ordered these pre-wired ones for simplicity, but I also ordered these disassembled ones simply because I wanted the rubber shrouds that came with them. By this point, I had already done 3 of them, but I left the final one to be filmed. So, step 1, cut the old rubber shroud. Step 2 is to soften that tubing with heat because after 34 years, this stuff is absolutely rock hard. Now, I just gotta protect these wires with the new shroud and the heat shrink. Now, that's secure. After making the cut, strip the insulation from all wires involved with a stripper. Make sure to put the heat shrink on now because once you make the connections, fucking forget about it. Splice the wires using one of several techniques and get your soldering iron ready. Soldering is basically the process in which you take a hot rod of metal, the iron, and then you touch it to the copper for a little bit. The copper gets hot enough to melt the tin feeder wire, which has a relatively low melting point compared to other metals. It re-solidifies when it cools and it strengthens the splice. It's kind of like baby's first TIG welder, basically. Anytime I lengthen a wire or shorten a wire or splice a connection in this video at any point, then I follow this process of splice, solder, and insulate. So you can assume that every time I do it, this is what I'm doing. Now, the reason why I've rewired the injection harness like this is because I plan to reroute them like this. See, when K-Bikes leaves a factory, the wires are routed around the front, which in my opinion is pretty ugly. This is much better, plus I've got all this space for it, so I might as well use it. So now that I know the injector wires will work in this location, it's time to change the injection harness accordingly. For one, the main connection to the brain is still way too long for this shortened bike, so that's gonna have to be dealt with. The ground wires and the connection to the ignition harness are a good enough length to reach through the bottom of the ground plate right here. The throttle position sensor wire was fine too, as was the airflow sensor wires. The cooling temperature sensor wires were a little long, so that will have to be shortened. I got on those tasks, but the sun was actually beginning to set, so by the time I finished the cooling wires, it was dark and I had to wrap everything up. When it came to the brain wires, I actually just removed the tubing and simply looped the wires around and then taped over the loop because I didn't want to splice that many wires. Holy shit. Moving on to the next day, I installed some rubber grommets all around the holes of the grounding plate, to protect the wires and protect the zip ties from the sharp metal edges. Most of them were in vain though, because these didn't really have enough inner diameter to allow enough wires to pass through them. I ultimately just drilled larger holes and lined them with a shitload of green electrical tape. Now that the injection harness was mounted up, I switched my attention back to the ignition harness by studying the BMW factory wiring diagram. So this morning, when I woke up, I actually had my wiring harness upstairs, so I was working on it, but I didn't want to do anything without being able to film it. So I basically just wrote down everything that I had figured out to kind of try to reduce this harness. So my goal is to basically separate everything on the power side from the injection side. So this is like starter relay, battery connections. You got the starter connection, the alternator. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna start trying to basically chop this in half and also get rid of that relay right there, that fuel pump relay. So the first thing I realized was that I could cut the brown and yellow wire that's going from the ignition control to the fuel pump. So that's this one right here. Everything else is cut, and these are wires that get power from this one that goes to the battery. So this basically activated this relay, which sent power from this red wire to these green and red wires. So we can get rid of this. We don't need this anymore. So what I'm going to do is it goes from the relay to the ignition control. So it goes to here and goes through into that connection to the igniter. So I'm going to cut it and just insulate it right here, shrink wrap it, wrap some tape around it just to, you know, close it off. The second thing is the red wire to the red 12 volt wire, this one that goes from the battery to the fuel injection relay. That could be cut because, well, after this nothing will be coming out of it, so it's pretty much useless. So I'm gonna cut this off, chuck that relay, and then maybe I could reuse this wire. I most likely will for whatever other 12 volt you know, accessory I need to power. So then I changed my attention to the starter solenoid, and it has 5 connections on it. You got one that goes to 12 volt from the battery, gives the solenoid power. Then the other one goes to the starter motor. That's this cable right here. So battery, starter, then you got these 3 little cables. You got 2, well, you got, first of all, you got the ground cable. That's the brown and red one. Now, since the box that this sat in was plastic, they actually grounded like all the way through to this. But we can get rid of that because, well, I'm going to be grounding it on a aluminum plate, so I could just ground it straight to that. Then you got these 2 black and yellow cables, which one of them actually went to the starter switch, and I can see that from when I first cut this thing apart. But the other one goes to, what is this called? This will be a little bit easy to look at once I start cutting things down more. But this one goes to the fuel injection. This one goes to the fuel injection harness and plugs into the brain or whatever. It eventually makes its way to the brain, but apparently we don't need this. So what I'm gonna do, just to be safe, is cut it and then insulate it, shrink wrap it and all that from this side, and then keep it live from here. Like keep a nice little length of wire from here. All right, pause. Do not cut this black and yellow wire that goes from the starter relay to the fuel injection harness. Leave it alone. What this wire does is send a signal to the injection brain when the starter is activated to run the engine a little richer to help with starting. Basically, an engine starting tune for a brief second while you're holding the starter down. Don't cut this wire, or if you do cut it, either reconnect it to the relay or plug it into the start output along with the other 2 black and yellows. It was smart of me to keep the wire lengthy and labeled just in case, because I wasn't really too sure what to do with it right here, but I'll talk more about that later. I don't think I will need those, but this one went to the starter switch as well. So it was 2 wires that go to the starter switch. There's this one and that one down there, which goes to the solenoid. So I'll put it to the start output. All right, pause again. Sorry, just some extra info. The wire in my hand goes to the ignition brain from the start output to tell the ignition that the engine is started. Remember, we spoke about this one from the start. It went to the starter switch initially, so I'm gonna plug it into the starter output on the M unit. So I'm gonna do all that real quick, and then I should be able to cut this out and then split this in half, and then just have to deal with this as far as the ignition goes. Okay, so I got everything split in half. This fuel injection relay is no longer needed, so what we do have is the ignition system, sort of, and the power side. So just to run through it again, since everything is a little bit neater, a little bit easier to see, we got the connections for the ignition coils, which run all the way through. So these go from the coils to the RPM gauge. This one goes to the starter switch, like I mentioned. And then this goes to the M unit, and it needs to connect to both the coils and also the ignition control unit. Supposedly. I mean, we got to test this. But it should be a junction that basically connects these two cables from the M unit output on the ignition side to boom, the control unit for the ignition, and boom, the coils themselves, which fire the spark plugs. These go to the Hall sensors, which basically tells the brain where the crank is and tells which, basically when to fire the spark plugs, which goes through the control unit to the coils, right? So this is a ground cable for the something along this circuit, because it starts right here. So maybe either the brain or the ignition brain rather, or the Hall sensors. But either way, it has to be grounded. This went to the temperature relay because this would tell the injection harness would sense the coolant temperature and tell the fan when to turn on. But like I said, that's going to be manual, so we don't need that anymore. But I still labeled it, just for my information. This needs power from the M unit, so I marked which ones need power with the red pen. M unit. And then there's also the fuel pump, but remember that's going to be on a separate wire to the auxiliary, because I want to be able to run that manually. So when I turn the switch, it's not like the fuel pump is just running, making a bunch of noise. And then this goes to the fuel injection harness, which I didn't really need to modify. I only shortened it and lengthened it in certain places. I didn't cut anything off. You don't really need to. But yeah, theoretically, this should do the trick. I mean, my fingers are crossed, at least. Now, when it comes to the power side, you got the alternator connection. You got battery positive connections for the starter solenoid, the alternator, and the relay that we cut off. We got the starter power cable that goes to the solenoid. We got some switches that I'm pretty sure will have to go to the output. I have to go to the output on the M unit for start, which will activate this relay, which will then send power from here to the starter cable, which will activate the starter. I'm gonna cut this open so I can split it off and make it a little bit easier to look at. Okay, so I cut off the tubing that connected these positive wires together. So I'm gonna run through what all these things do. You got the loop connections for the positive on the battery. You got the alternator connection, which there's actually an important thing to note. There's this wire right here, and this goes to a light on the dashboard. That basically, it's a charging light, basically, that tells you that everything is working right with the alternator and stuff. If you don't plug this in, the bike won't charge. Now, you could get away for a few days, without this being plugged in, but for long term, you have to plug this light in. So what I'm going to do at some point is I'm going to go into the gauge cluster and rip the light out and then plug it into this and complete that circuit or whatever, because it won't charge without it, which is kind of nuts. This went to the fuel pump relay, so it's not really needed, but this is a good red positive, decent length cable, so I'm definitely going to reuse that. This one goes to the starter solenoid, and then this one goes to the starter itself. So once you trip one of these, I forget which one, but once you trip one of these yellow wires, it sends power to the relay. This brown one is connected to ground, and you trip the relay, which sends the power from the battery to the starter. So yeah, that's pretty much how all this works. How I think I'm gonna route this is basically I'm gonna run the starter solenoid to the battery, and then see how they had it from the factory. They had this coming off somewhere. I forgot where this went. I think this. Matter of fact, I think I went to the fuse box. This cut one. I'm pretty sure that's where that went. So I'm gonna make a joint right here, and then connect this part to the M unit. Kind of bounce it off. Alright, now don't freak out. All you're seeing is what you just seen on that table crammed into the bike to mock it up. I just need to see where to route wires and if everything will fit well enough under the tank. The ignition harness and the starter relay will reside under the tank, and by this point I mostly figured out what I was going to do to route the wires. I even hooked up the old throttle to see if it could be opened and closed with no issues. Jesus, I hope somebody got that guy a muffler for Christmas. After some serious mileage on my thinking cap, I loomed up the ignition harness like so. This is my junction for the 3 wires that go into the M unit ignition output, minus the wire for the fuel pump and the gas tank, because remember, the plan was to wire that separately into the auxiliary output. So this connector goes to the starter solenoid. This one has to go to the output on the M unit. This one, I think I don't need this one. I'm just gonna insulate it. I'm not gonna cut it, I'm just gonna insulate it and leave it there just in case, but I don't think I need it. Okay, pause. You do need this one, like I said in the last pause. The one labeled starter switch is the one that trips the relay. The one labeled injection harness tells the injection brain that the bike is being started. If you're confused about the black and yellow I plugged into the M unit outside, that's the one that tells the ignition that the bike is being started. And then this one is ground, so I'm just gonna extend these two outer ones and then insulate this middle one. So originally I was gonna use this leftover red cable to just splice right there and then connect this loop to the M unit itself. But I think what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna use the cable that came with it, because you can see how much thicker this cable is compared to this. And I read the instructions, and they don't advise using any cable less thick than this. I've seen people do it with thinner cable than this. It seems like overkill, but I'm just gonna listen. So instead, I'm just gonna insulate this off, cut that down and insulate it, and then just run this straight to the M unit from the battery. After getting all the wires routed and loomed up, there wasn't much more I could do. I couldn't start the bike because I didn't have the long enough battery cables, spark plug cables, starter cable, and the water pump cover still wasn't on, and the engine had 0 oil. So I just dug up that old giant gauge cluster and ripped into it for that charging light. This thing was broken in more ways than one, so I really don't feel bad about destroying it. After that, I shifted over to sorting out the controls, which I had been avoiding. So before I do anything, when it comes to the lighting and the controls and stuff, I gotta set up the wires on these switches right here. So these are the Moto Gadget M switches, and I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 buttons. But the thing about these in particular is that they don't actually come like pre-wired, so you have to set up the wires, the wire connections yourself. And these are momentary ground switches, which means that when you press the button, it makes contact with whatever grounding surface you have. So if I were to plug one end of these terminals, well, let me take the button out so you can see it. So these buttons screw in. So these have 2 screw terminals on the end right there. So if you were to plug one end into the M unit for whatever you want to operate, and then the other end onto the grounding plate or whatever you're grounding it with, you know. Some people ground it through the handlebar, some people ground it through the chassis, the frame, the triple, whatever. I'm gonna ground it directly to the grounding plate that I have under the tank, just to keep it simple. Put one terminal to the grounding plate, the other one to the input that you want to operate on the M unit. Hold the wire down with like 2 little screws on the end there. So you back them out, you put the wire through, and then you just tighten it again, and you just retighten it. And when you press the button, it makes the contact on both sides. So it makes a circuit from the grounding plate through the button to the M unit. And that momentary ground is what operates the M unit. Now, generally speaking, when it comes to switches like this, what you do is you drill a hole into your handlebar so you can route the wires through it. But we already established that, unfortunately, these are not actually hollow. So I can't really do that. Unless I drill like a hole through. It's not practical. So what I'm gonna do is you see on this one, I was gonna drill a hole through the side right there, on each side for both, and then just route the wires through those and see if that works. I'm still thinking about it, but first I gotta fix up the wires, and I'll probably do that at work if it's slow enough. But right now, I just gotta get all this stuff away because I'm done. Oh yeah, and these are the light bulbs, all the light bulbs that came out the gauge cluster. And this is what held the gas lights, and I could put 2 if I could get the gas gauge working, at least one of them, because you have the one that comes on when you're at 7 liters, whatever that is, and then 4 liters. So if I could because I have the wires for both of them, but if I could figure out which one is which, then I'll plug one up, put the light inside of here, and then also put the alternator light, the charging light, have it in this little thingy right here, maybe like stick it under the tank, just look down, see if the bike is charging right or if I'm low on gas. I ended up drilling out 2 holes. Come with this threaded hole in the middle, you see there, where you could actually screw your ground terminals if you want to ground it to the handlebar. But instead, what I did was I just drilled it out, and I also drilled out a second one. So I'm gonna mount these to the handlebar, and then just have the wires coming through here out the backside, and then just route them this way into the frame. So I bought all the stuff that I needed with me to work so I could wire in those switches, including that fancy M unit wiring kit. Right, so this is the method I use for the switch housing. Remove the button, back out the terminal screws, insert the wires through both terminals, and then rinse repeat for all 3 buttons in the housing. Now, I use heat shrink without heat to protect the wires from the edges of the housing. It's a very snug fit, so nothing should rub around here. You have to route the wires around the inside, which has sort of a hollow space to go around the handlebar and in between the buttons. If your handlebars are hollow, you can route the wires through the handlebars if you drill a hole, but I can't do that, so I had to get a little bit more creative, and I had a little bit more trouble cramming the wires through the housing to come out at one point, but I managed to pull it off. And once I got home, I tested my connections and mounted them up the next day. I use zip ties to maintain the proper slack for the wires so nothing gets pulled on. You know, I kind of like the sort of symmetry that this has with the brake lines on the other side, the way they both come out the bottom. Since the wires are all color-coded, all you have to do is take one of each wire and send one to the ground location, and then the other of the same color to the M unit input. For the ground junction for the controls, I actually just reused one of the old handlebar ground connectors and I mounted it to the plate. Remember how I said that I wanted to run the fuel pump on a different circuit? Well, turns out I don't have to. See, my logic was assuming that the ignition output would always stay on, and therefore the fuel pump would always stay on. But you can actually turn off the ignition output regardless of whether the engine is running or not. So basically you turn the key, right? The ignition output automatically turns on. But if you double tap the start button even while the engine is not running yet, you can turn off the ignition output. Hell, you could probably even use the phone app to configure the M unit to not activate the ignition until you hit the starter button after you turn the key. So yeah, I'll eventually splice the fuel pump into the ignition junction and just shut it down after turning the key if need be. But who am I kidding, man? Keys are for plebs. Fobs, that's where it's at. This is the M-lock. It comes with a little tiny fuse, a relay if you plan to use this without an M unit for some reason, mounting hardware, a master key and a user key, and then the sensor itself. See, I wanted to mount it here, but that didn't really work. Either way, I just wanted to test to see how it would work, or if I could get it to work myself. Basically, the red wire is a hot wire to positive, the black wire goes to ground, and the brown wire goes to the lock input on the M unit. Now, this is a quick and dirty installation, but it still works. So, with the ignition working, the controls working, and hell, even the starter working after getting those longer cables, it was time to make arrangements to start the bike. One of which was to get longer spark plug cables, since I've relocated to coils, and Cafe 4 Racer has just that. They also sent me a really nice feeling t-shirt for free. It's made of that like stretchy soft cotton, which is cool, but I wish it were a size or two smaller because I'll be swimming in this XL. They also sent a boatload of stickers. The main attraction though was the spark plug leads themselves, which will easily reach the coils under the tank. The next arrangement was to finally strip the oil pump cover and to put it back on the bike. After some easy off oven cleanup, some sanding, I had that dull raw aluminum finish that I wanted. Installing new injectors, fuel rail, and coil leads, done. Next up, engine oil. And I really cheaped out with this one. I didn't want to spend $40 on some super high quality oil just to potentially have to drain it out again. So instead I bought a 5-liter jug of Amazon branded car oil. K-bikes have a dry clutch, given it basically is the running gear of a car. So you could use car oil in a pinch. This jug cost me $16 on Amazon, and it's basically the same Supertech shit that you buy from Walmart. When it's time to actually ride the bike, I'll get some proper oil in there. Right, so let's just see if the oil pump we rebuilt is actually moving oil around the system before we plug in the ignition and injection system. Keep an eye on the oil level as the engine spins over. Bingo. Let's do this. Moment of truth. Not quite. Disheartening? Yeah, very much so. This was weeks of work and research in the making, but I had nothing to show for it. And on top of that, I blew the starter relay. The problem could be one of 100 things here, and how the hell would I ever know which one it was? I barely even know what I'm doing here. How long will it take before I find this issue? Should I just start the whole process over? What does this say about the 200 plus files of video that I filmed in this wiring episode alone? What was I even thinking? See, if you're an anxious bastard like me, this is what goes through your head after something like this happens. But who gives a flying fuck about what you think? It's about what you do. And I'm good at doing. So, what do? You troubleshoot. What does an engine run on? Fuel, spark, and air. Always test that you're getting all three. Fuel. I removed the injectors from the head and aimed them at the ground. Since the starter relay was melted down inside, I had to hotwire the starter lead over to the 12-volt side of the relay, skipping the inner connection. Now sparks fly when you do that. It's dangerous around gas, but I cranked the starter anyway. All four of them rhythmically shot healthy mists of gasoline all over the cement. Fuel injection is working. Spark. One by one, I removed the spark plugs from the head and rested each body onto the valve cover to ground them out. All four gave off a healthy blue spark. In real life, the spark is clear as day, but it's harder to see it on camera. Ignition system is working. Air. Well, the bushings on the throttle bodies are brand new, but the inlets at the bottom are not actually clamped down because they're ripped and I plan to replace them by now. I never did, but I should have still clamped them. The air intake to the airflow sensor also wasn't clamped down, nor was the vacuum hose for the crankcase. But surely this wouldn't stop the bike from firing up, would it? I mean, I know it would just run like dog shit, but it would still fire up, right? Well, fixing those issues would only help my chances, so I better get to it. Fuel, spark, air. Fuel, spark, air. But I wasn't sold on the idea that a few air leaks would stop this engine from firing up, so at work I spent a good amount of time researching. The wise man doesn't know everything, but he knows where to find it. See, there's a troubleshooting guide for K-bikes when it comes to starting issues, written by a bloke named Bertrand Vogel, under the forum alias of Crazy Frog, and I probably read through that 30-page document about 3 times, cross-referencing it with the original BMW diagram and Mikey's diagram. See, I came with 4 potential solutions for getting this lady running. I already spoke about the sealing up of the air intake. See, there's this physical flap that rotates as the air pushes through it into the breathing engine. The vacuum must be strong enough to move it as the computer picks up on the change in resistance from where the flap is. This influences the amount of fuel that gets pushed in. Next, do you remember that one wire that went from the start output to the injection system? That black and yellow wire goes to pin 4 on the brain, basically telling the brain to use the starting fuel map. This makes it easier for the engine to start, and the other black and yellow wire originally went to both the starter relay and the ignition brain. Then the one that goes to the relay bounces to the injection. So basically all 3 things need to start a signal: injection, ignition, and starter relay. Make sure of that. Then I had taken note to recreate the ground point on the frame itself. The ground plate and the running gear itself were all grounded, but due to the powder coat, I don't think the frame itself was. Perhaps we needed more resistance than what was currently being used for ground. And lastly, the coolant temperature switch. There are 2 wires of the same exact color that go to the 2 resistor sensors that collect the exact same coolant temperature. One wire goes to the injection brain and tells it, hey, the engine is operating at normal temperature range. The other one goes to the temperature sensor relay, which will then activate the fan if a certain temperature is reached. One of them can go bad independently of the other one though. So, for example, the one feeding the fan switch can go bad and just affect the fan coming on. But the other one can go bad and prevent the engine from starting because the brain is like, what is this ridiculously stupid temperature you're trying to start the engine at? Fuck you, dude. You know, to save the overheated engine. Meanwhile, the temperature is fine. The signal is just reading that the water is at 275 degrees F. So I don't know what that would do to the spark and the fuel to prevent the engine from running, since I was getting both spark and fuel. But it was worth a shot simply switching the wires, because why not just run the brain off the other resistor to see what happens. I got to work the next day.
I ain't no joke. I used to let the mic smoke. Now I slam it when I'm done and make sure it's throat. When I'm gone, no one gets on, cause I won't let nobody press up and mess up the scene I set. I like to stand in the crowd and watch the people wonder, damn. But think about it, then you understand. I'm just an addict, addicted to music. Maybe it's a habit, I gotta use it. Even if it's jazz or the quiet storm, I hook a beat up, convert it into hip-hop form. Write a rhyme and graffiti in every show you see me in. Deep concentration, cause I'm no comedian. Jokers are wild. If you wanna be tame, I treat you like a child, then you're gonna be named another enemy, not even a friend of me. Cause you'll get fried in the end when you pretend to be competing. Cause I just put your mind on pause and I complete when you compare my rhyme with yours. I wake you up and as I stare in your face, you seem stunned. Remember me, the one you got your idea from. But soon you start to suffer, the tune will get rougher. When you start to stutter, that's when you had enough of fighting it'll make you choke. You can't provoke, you can't cope, you should've broke. Because I ain't no joke.
I even took a trip back to Advanced Auto for electrical contact cleaner, and I cleaned every single open connection. Alright, let's try this again. Fingers crossed. Fired up. I wasn't convinced though, so I tried to do it again. Thing is, I was moving so fast that I forgot to reconnect the brain. And not to mention the bike brain too.
I got a question, as serious as cancer. Who can keep the average dancer hyper as a heart attack? Nobody's smiling, cause you're expressing the rhyme that I'm styling. This is what we all sit down and write. You can't make it, so you take it home, break it and bite. These pieces and bits of all my hip-hop hits. Get the style down packed in, it's time to switch.
I fired it up again and I gave it a small blip of throttle, but I immediately shut it down because A, the engine is still cold for revs. B, there's no coolant in it whatsoever. And C, I want to hook up a light to the oil pressure sensor to make sure that it's getting around, just to double check. I know the oil level dropped, implying that the pump is working, but I just want to double check and I don't want to run this thing too hard right now. You know, what I got was good enough for me. Some gas dripping out of the exhaust, but I'm sure that's just from when I flooded it the day before. Because remember, I was cranking on the engine to try to start it, and then I was cranking to see if it had spark. All the while, the injectors are shooting unburnt fuel into the cylinders. So it must have dripped out into the pipes from the open valves, and it got blown out the muffler when the bike was finally started, dripped back down the outside of the pipes, and then created a puddle on the ground. There's also a little black pieces of rubber at the end of the exhaust, which might mean that I might have to replace my fuel lines because they probably broke down from sitting, for a few months. But yeah, that's it. Wiring a K-bike with an M unit. What a process. Alright, what's next? Well, I have to clean up the wiring as well as begin handling some more odds and ends around the bike. So from front to back, here's what's left that I can remember right now. The front fender, brake fluid, I have to wire up the Motoscope Mini, install those intake boots, throttle and clutch cable, new radiator. I have to finish the gas tank, clean up the wiring, mount the battery, the license plate, the rear lights, and the final hard part, the seat. But I have a plan with that one. I already have the Motoscope, the intake boots, the throttle and clutch cable, the radiator, the battery tray, the license plate, and the metal sheet for the seat pan. I just gotta get to it. I can see the finish line from here, and I'm ready to cross it and begin my actual 2020. Thank you guys for watching, and I hope this video really helps anyone who's looking to wire their bike like this. If you do, you can shed this much in electronics, man. It's nuts. Whew. Anyway, I'll see you guys on the next one. Thanks again.